On behalf of the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, I have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Rem Koolhaas from Netherlands. And I've been asked to make a very short introduction, and to a certain extent this introduction wouldn't and is not needed. But still, let's talk a couple of minutes about the background of Rem Koolhaas. And Rem, I'm sorry you heard this most yesterday, but the rest of you, it will be as new as ever. Rem Koolhaas, a Dutch by birth but global architect and a professor at Harvard University, has been in the absolute center of contemporary architectural discourse and practice for now almost 50 years. Dubbed as the Le Corbusier of our time, he shares with the modernist master a commitment to discussing architecture and the world we live in through the medium of both text and buildings. Born in Rotterdam during the end of the World War and partly raised in Jakarta, a childhood which may well be the unconscious depth behind the profoundly global outlook. Starting his career as a scriptwriter and journalist, he soon focused on architecture with studies at the Architectural Association in London between 1968 and 72. A school which at that time was at the forefront of criticizing the then stale-made modernist architecture. To the school he brought a sense of avant-garde, radical thought and architecture that had been growing in the European mainland. Rem Koolhaas' rise to prominence started already there at the school as a student with a provocative project called the Berlin Wall as Architecture, later developed into a thesis project called the Wall Exodus, or the Voluntary Prisoners of Architecture, in 1972. Exodus, now owned by MoMA, initiated the theme of an architecture of both freedom and constraint, so frequent in Koolhaas' work. How can architecture, by acknowledging the reality as it exists, have the liberty to create new structures and new social rules? But Rem Koolhaas' definite international breakthrough came with the now iconic book Delirious New York, co-produced with Madelon Riesendorp and Fou and Elia Sengelis, with whom he earlier in 1975 had founded OMA, the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, an office still alive today that has been described as an anarchic, creative pressure cooker, where Rem Koolhaas is the editor-in-chief. The book, published in 1978, was a surrealist-inspired retroactive manifesto for Manhattan, addressing architecture and urban culture in a way nobody had done before. His first important architectural project, we can count the competition entry for Parc de la Villette in Paris, 1982, lost to Bernard Chaumy, and the Kunsthal, a contemporary art museum in Rotterdam, completed 10 years later. Since then, Rem Koolhaas, with his office OMA, has been involved in a range of important buildings around the world. The Seattle Central Library and Casa da Musica in Porto, both inaugurated 2005, is to me anyhow regarded as his most innovative. Cecil Balmond, the famous structural engineer and thinker, longtime collaborator with Rem Koolhaas, has described his working method as stupid but smart. Not only as a theorist and writer does Rem Koolhaas stir controversies. His engagement in China with the CCTV headquarters in Beijing has been as criticized as it has been admired. So, for all of you who want to learn more about Rem Koolhaas' architecture and his thinking, this lecture today, and maybe even a discussion afterwards, will be an introduction. But I strongly recommend, despite the uncountable books written about him, to turn to his own writings and books such as S, small, medium, large, XL, which I guess everybody almost in this room have in their bookshelf, but maybe not everybody has read it. Spanning his work until 1995, and Content, which spans up to 2004. The last is a groundbreaking version of an architect's monograph produced in close cooperation with Simon Brown and John Link at End. The project of the City One, Great Leap Forward, was seminal in describing the urban development of China since Deng Xiaoping's opening up of the economy in 1979, and is a result of the Rem Koolhaas teaching at Harvard. The title, of course, can be read as a typical Rem Koolhaas two-sided irony. In reciprocal relationship to AMO was set up in 1998 as an output for Rem Koolhaas' surplus creative energy. As OMA's publishing and research wing, sort of a think tank, it has enabled Rem Koolhaas to expand way beyond architecture. The Guggenheim exhibition, Countryside, the Future, set up just a couple of years ago, 2020, and the work with UNESCO about World Heritage is coordinated by AMO and may signal a new interest of Rem Koolhaas. And with that, I welcome you to this table.
Thank you very much. I will try to give an efficient lecture so that we can almost immediately jump into the conversation. And it so happens that I'm in a good position to give lectures these days, because I'm working on not necessarily an autobiography, but an effort to digest my life so far. And when I talk about my life, I'm also talking about my generation, because I think born in '44, my generation had the kind of privilege. My generation was, of course, deeply marked by the year '68, which is in a way a cliche, and which for most of you will be considered the year of boomers. But in any case, it did leave a deep mark on me. But we were also able to work almost anywhere in the world, because somehow globalization started as a kind of very serious and expensive effort when we were basically in our 30s and 40s. And when I look at this biographical element, I realized that it is impossible to kind of write a linear story, because to do justice to the kind of to each of the different components, I should write a book about my kind of self in terms of my Russian life, my English life, my American life, my Chinese life, my African life, and my Italian life. And what I mean by that is that it is not only that we were involved in all these countries, but that these countries kind of deeply marked me and our work, and that therefore there was a kind of mutual kind of interaction that is extremely hard to convey, of course, but which nevertheless I want to kind of talk about. So I was born in '44. In '51, the European Union was created. I lived in Indonesia at the time, but nevertheless, I think unconsciously it was a very important step, because I barely ever kind of felt myself being Dutch, but almost always thought of myself as European, even as a kind of young Dutch kind of person in the Netherlands. This is the kind of signing of one of the Treaty of Rome in 1957. And what is interesting, this is a reunion of a number of European artists. connected in the group Zero, may be familiar here. And this is a direct consequence of the European contracts. And it is the first time that basically kind of people from France and artists from France, Yves Klein, and artists from Germany were kind of simply through this new context of European Union, were collaborating. And therefore, each of them was kind of basically inspired by Europe, but also kind of affecting Europe. And I would say that this is also the moment that I, as a kind of boy, became kind of vaguely aware of different art movements. So I cannot emphasize enough to what extent all of this was an inspiration. So this was May '68, and at the very least, I think it was kind of very interesting for all of us to see that the state of affairs of kind of reality could be changed quite radically in a very short time. Basically, in 4 days, the whole of France was converted in kind of state of panic, and things would never be quite the same. And whether that was a good or a bad thing, it was at least a kind of sign that even the state of apparent stability can be changed at any moment. In '72, not so much later, I got a fellowship to go to America. And I want to explain what America then kind of represented. America, and this is a book published in the same year by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, on Las Vegas. America was then a kind of center of popular culture, so-called. Popular culture was not a negative term. It was not kind of basically a reality show, not any of the kind of currently quite debased and negative manifestations of popular culture. Popular culture was a creative source, and from that source, architecture could learn. And that was the point of Venturi and Scott Brown. They wanted to learn about Las Vegas. And I, at the same time, kind of was working here. They are in an interview that we had with them. I was working at the same time on a book, The Lyrics New York, that appeared 6 years later, but which was definitely inspired by them. I want to, in this lecture, kind of really emphasize an aspect which is not very often kind of emphasized in terms of what my interests are. And sorry for, I always say we, but in this case, I need to say me. And that is an interest and fascination, but also an ambition to decipher the impact of technology on our lives, not only on architecture, but on our lives in general. And we live currently in a kind of situation where it is a cliche that kind of social media, kind of Google, etc., have created a kind of virtuality, and that we're all kind of dependent on our mobile phones, etc., etc. But what I wanted to emphasize, and which I think has been a driving force between a lot of the work, is that this process didn't start 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It was already going on kind of for a very, very long time. And you could say that the whole idea of a metropolis is already a kind of architecture which is profoundly modified and changed through technology. So here I started to do New York research in kind of studying entertainment as it was developing not in the city of Manhattan, but on a kind of resort, on a place on a beach called Coney Island. And here you see kind of a number of things in this single picture. You see that one of the kind of qualities of that situation is an incredible density. Really, people are kind of compacted in a way that never has existed before, but they're also sandwiched between a train and a kind of artificial kind of motorway. So it's basically a state of complete artificiality that apparently in this kind of situation is relatively attractive. And so here you see that kind of electricity itself could be used to extend the 24-hour cycle of bathing, that experiences such as horse riding through nature were kind of represented or were organized on a large scale, but in an artificial way on this island, and that certain experimentations actually took place where, for instance, seeing whether two trains could meet each other going in opposite direction on a kind of single track. And I think that if you look at some of the ambitions of, for instance, Elon Musk at this moment, you see that 100 years before there is the preparation for a kind of similar kind of mentality. In this entertainment center, they even had the most sophisticated premature baby installation hospital, and that was a spectacle how non-viable human beings through technology could get a chance, and that itself became an attraction. So this is a kind of vision of Coney Island at night. And what is interesting is that you not only see a kind of city based in artificial light, but you also see the manifestation of the first skyscrapers, and significantly kind of some of the developers of these pleasure areas later developed architecture in New York. And in terms of artificiality, this is a cartoon that appeared in New York in 1909. And it shows kind of really how radical the surrender to technology was at that moment, because what it represented, you could take a standard kind of suburban environment, a house and some nature, and multiply it. And basically you could multiply it because there was steel, and maybe more than that, there was an elevator. Both new technologies, and particularly the elevator at that point, an invention not more than 40 years old. And so basically, again, from this kind of situation, suddenly emerged this situation. And in a certain way, I think it's slightly misleading that Delirious New York is associated with surrealism, because this has nothing to do with surrealism. This is kind of simply a form of development which is driven by technological innovation, and which creates a kind of massively disruptive effects. And of course, the word disruption, has received a new currency also in kind of Silicon Valley. But I would say that this is kind of really a very drastic reduction that was there already kind of very long time before that. And what I find kind of really amazing is how certain inventions, perhaps like the elevator or like the kind of escalator, were almost kind of perfect at the moment that they were launched, and actually almost barely underwent substantial improvement over their lives. This is a kind of building which was proposed in New York, simply an extrusion of the territory, but its air conditioning system basically proposed to use salt air, fresh air, dry salt air, perfumes, medicated air. So immediately the elevator was combined with air conditioning, and air conditioning was not seen as a kind of simply pragmatic way in which you could support human life, but it was seen as a kind of a machinery that could induce all kinds of other sensations that were not possible by any other means. Not possible by any other means. And I would say, kind of, again, this is a kind of period of kind of maybe 15 years, and in those 15 years, this whole thing is born. This maybe the most drastic manifestation of that kind of architecture was a building which I discovered in Manhattan, which was called the Downtown Athletic Club, a series of kind of sports that were kind of superimposed, and a collective floor, and then a series of bedrooms. And if you look at the kind of single plan, you see a locker room. Lockers are where you get undressed, you take your clothes off, an elevator, a bank, of course. Next to it, there was a kind of boxing ring, and here there was an oyster bar. And so I would say, and that at that time was my main interest, how does technology enable life to be lived completely different, and what kind of radical combinations can be imagined, not through the support of architecture, but more through the support of these technologies. How can life be imagined in a different way? And so this is a drawing that I then made, kind of eating oysters with boxing gloves, naked, a combination that never had kind of existed before. Anyway, so this is kind of one, let's say, beginning period of an exploration of architecture. But then, of course, architecture is not an independent entity, and maybe more than other domains or forms of knowledge, it is completely dependent on kind of political change and on political situations. So 6 years later, after kind of finishing the book about New York, there was a triumph of Ronald Reagan in America and Margaret Thatcher in England. And what they did together, collectively, was to abandon and to discredit the credibility of the public sector, and to kind of emphasize the market economy as a kind of final arbiter of every kind of single decision, and also therefore radically kind of change architecture, because from a tool or an expression of the interest of the kind of public sector and public life, suddenly the architect became, in very many cases, a tool of the developer. And I would say that the interesting thing is that immediately also had a kind of effect, of course, on technology, but particularly on the kind of way technology was kind of interpreted, where in the beginning there was a hedonistic dimension to it, but that is where I think there's a kind of close relationship between the market economy, Reagan, Silicon Valley, and the kind of current more authoritarian and kind of more surveillance-oriented kind of form of technology. That, for instance, you can, technology is now used in kind of many ways to seemingly kind of improve life, but very often with a kind of more sinister dimension. This is kind of basically a thermostat that learns about you, and which means that kind of basically it collects data and then transfers those data and to other big companies that are interested, energy companies, but also other companies. And I would say that, you know, the net effect of these technologies as they are now present in our houses, kind of more and more, is that architecture no longer provides kind of independent environment where you can be on your own. More and more, this integration of the technology kind of makes even your most private life kind of public in ways that you don't exactly know. Anyway, that's another little episode. Anyway, I come back to Europe. Europe, in the meantime, in '51, it was kind of 6 states, the founders of the EU. By the year 2000, became bigger and bigger. And actually, in 1989, when the kind of wall fell, I would say that there was a collective period of euphoria about the extension of Europe, and particularly about what Europe could represent. We were almost chauvinistically happy with enlargement, because it meant that we were a superpower, not in terms of arms, but in terms of size, maybe kind of between 300 and 400 million kind of people, and therefore, at least economically, kind of represented a phenomenal power, and also culturally, or at least that is what we thought. So I want to kind of show a project how basically that same kind of euphoria inspired architecture. And so what the point of this whole lecture is to show you that architecture is not kind of something that emerges from your inside, but that it is a constant kind of reflection and triggered by external forces. So I now want to kind of show a project that is the most typical, perhaps, of that period of '89. It was where the kind of French Mitterrand, who last socialist president, who kind of obviously, or not the last, but socialist president, who really believed in the state, organized a number of what they called grands projets, large projects that were supposed to articulate the new organs or the new entities of not only the new France, but also the new Europe. And one of the things he organized was a competition for an enormous library, which seemed kind of a little bit foolish to organize a library at the kind of moment that the digital revolution was kind of beginning to happen. But at the same time, for us, it was kind of extremely interesting to see whether you could, at that point, already define a relationship between the digital and the real that would make sure that both could coexist and not at the expense of each other. And therefore, and this is why I kind of showed our interest in technology kind of from the very beginning. Here, again, we were really focused on technology, and this is a project from 1989, so it is kind of 33 years old, and in that sense, I'm kind of really quite impressed myself. This scheme is based on technological scenarios developed with inventors, system analysis, writers, electronics company, which was actually true, because and that is basically true of the kind of way we work. We never work simply as architects, but always share not only responsibility, but also try to kind of collect knowledge from other domains. They all anticipate the utopia of fully integrated information systems to materialize before the opening of the building. Books, films, music, computers will be read on the same magic tablet. So that's how we called the devices that we actually made a kind of prototype of. We had a tablet. The tablet worked in terms of kind of giving you access to books and to films, to literally everything. And so what we actually kind of did is kind of to propose a data center in '89. The future will spell not the end of the book, but blah, blah, blah. So our project was kind of really, I would say, kind of radical. We proposed a cube, 100 by 100 by 100 meters, that was a solid storage of data. So it was a data center. And basically, the different libraries, the different aspects of the libraries, there were 5 different entities, were not kind of represented as buildings or as shapes, but they were excavated, scooped out from this data center. And then there were on 9 kind of sites in the building, there were kind of elevators that made sure that kind of everything in the building, wherever it would occur, was accessible. And so here you see the kind of first sketch. So what we thought is that we simply have floors with data, and we don't bother creating interesting forms or building interesting forms. What we do, we excavate forms. We create kind of negatives. And in that sense, it was a kind of really contemporary idea that a negative could be the main thing, and that it could coexist with these huge collectors of digital information. So also the first time that we worked with digital rendering programs, and so here you see the organs, the kind of public entities that existed within these enormous cubes. And because the building was kind of really solid and kind of supported by concrete walls, there was enormous freedom in the kind of shapes that you could excavate from this mass. Here you see the kind of representation. Everything which is black is data, and everything which is white is public space, except the lines that are concrete walls that can provide both structure and air. And this is the superposition of all the kind of public entities. And here you see, almost similar to the plans, the sections where you see in black the concrete walls and in white the perforations that those public spaces kind of generated in there. This was a facade, a deliberately vague statement of different realities kind of exposed on the same plane. And in order to kind of show what we were doing, we basically built 2 models. This one, the solid one, which represented the data center, and here a kind of reversal where the voids were also kind of represented as solid. The unfortunate thing about architecture is that you almost can never hope that this kind of invention, because I would say it's a kind of real invention, but also an invention whether an element like a data center can become part of public life and not an isolated and kind of secretive thing in the kind of on the North Pole. And how the life can be organized in such a way that a citizen is constantly aware of everything that is kind of stored and why it is stored and how you can enjoy what is stored. But there is almost never an opportunity. You basically don't win a competition with that kind of statement. I skipped this. Okay, so this was European euphoria and happiness with the kind of new scale of Europe, and an attempt to translate that new scale and that moment of euphoria in a non-abusive exploration of what technology could mean within architecture, and also a non-commercial exploration of what technology could mean. Within the overall expansion of the market economy that the age of neoliberalism kind of introduced. Then, basically, in '95, a few years later, there were kind of signs that the market economy would, Mitterrand disappeared. There were signs that the market economy was going to be, even in Europe, or maybe especially in Europe, becoming kind of more and more dominant. Many countries were in the process of deregulation, even the Netherlands, which is perhaps the most highly organized country in the world, which suddenly kind of gave up and is now in a kind of terrible mess because of that process. And so it was also possible to work in different other areas, and one of them kind of China. This basically shows a number of kind of projects and the overall engagements with China, kind of simply showing that it's not a kind of simply a one-off accident or a one-off a moment of opportunism, but that there are a sequence of kind of events and a sequence of engagements that show more than simply exploitation of a possibility, but also a real engagement with the conditions. We started going to China with an investigation of the Pearl River Delta. That was a very interesting situation. Then basically the name was almost never kind of really pronounced, but it turned out to be in the south of China, kind of around Hong Kong, that you see here, a region that already had contained, achieved 53 million people, and that was on its way to become a kind of urban situation with maybe 100,000 people, 100 million people. At the time, it was still not all Chinese. On the contrary, this was English. This was Shenzhen, a kind of city that a twin city with Hong Kong, Chinese, but a special economic zone. This is Guangzhou, Dongguan. This was still Portuguese, Macau. So it was a number of very different conditions. Also at that point politically, but it was clear that they were on the way to integration. It was a city that, initially was kind of very, or an environment that was still relatively innocent. There were many kind of fishing industry, agriculture. But in '78, the then president of China had announced that simply the pursuit of money was compatible with the interest of the Chinese Communist Party, and therefore launched again a Chinese version of the kind of market economy in China, and that created an enormous kind of boom in this whole situation. What was important for us is to understand what were the effects of architecture, what then, and how should we interpret or read these kind of situations. These are the kind of growth diagrams, and the Chinese also kind of built a bridge from Macau to Hong Kong, creating a kind of circular model of city. And when I say created, they kind of literally created, kind of with a highway. Interestingly enough, the Chinese don't kind of build infrastructure on the ground. They build it typically underground or above ground. So it has a kind of degree of independence of the kind of surface of the earth. And where we build infrastructure when it is necessary to solve a problem, in a way, in China, that is not the case. The infrastructure is kind of more treated as a kind of prediction, a prediction of future growth and a trigger of a particular plan for developing and creating almost out of nowhere these urban conditions. So again, complete artificiality. And they do it with a speed that makes an image like this one, kind of rice fields, agriculture, but also skyscrapers in a kind of single picture, quite normal. And basically, kind of regardless of my architectural opinion, I thought it was crucial to begin to look at this condition, because we Europeans at that point were still firmly convinced that our model of the city, composed, growing kind of over time, more or less coherent, was a universal city model of city that deserved to be rolled out over the world. But on the other side, both in everywhere in the world, there were the kind of evidence that the end of the 20th century, and certainly not the 21st century, would be developed according to those models. Here you see Shenzhen, the kind of downtown, the center. This is a poster, communist poster that says 100 years of no change. This is the major kind of urban intersection, but 400 meters away are the rice fields. And so this coexistence of agriculture and metropolis is kind of more and more, I think, the thing that we kind of need to prepare for. But at the same time, and this is kind of really trying to explain how you can be, as an architect, at the same time involved in kind of research in terms of how things are developing and what is going on in cultures that are different from our own and that we are typically judging negatively, but that may perhaps have kind of interesting aspects that we should at least know about. We also looked in kind of Hong Kong at a very notorious kind of project, a totally illegal project, which was called Kowloon Walled City. And that was basically a group of buildings that had been, that was kind of run in such an anarchistic, not to say criminal way, that all authorities had kind of pulled out. So it was basically a block that was left in Hong Kong totally to its own devices, and which therefore developed unique kind of architectural qualities that were not well understood because it was actually dangerous to enter. And you see that the building was turned almost into a kind of single solid block of building that you could kind of never even hope to document. But when we were there, we were we realized that the building was being demolished, and basically that demolishing then enabled us to understand the building. So we used the destruction of the building to document it. This is a kind of work by a student, Harvard student, Aaron Tan, where I can really pushed. And so what we did is, create almost like a brain scan, a number of kind of sections that showed how this building could be developed. And what we discovered is, and that was the most exciting discovery, is that, from single and identical footprints over time, this could be a kind of single property, or this would be a single property, or this would be a single property. So that you could treat the entire thing as a solid building, almost like the kind of Paris Library, and see how within this kind of solidity you could extend your kind of reach or your possession or your kind of lifestyle. And again, this then became, for us as architects, an important prototype of how you could step out of this kind of the rationality, of the architectural kind of system. And what we also kind of realized is that in order to build so quickly, and in order to kind of really make sure that your production could be adequate to the speed of building, that maybe Photoshop was a kind of new device, how you could combine kind of ideal conditions, a lake, a golf course, and a house, without all the kind of thinking and all the kind of intellectual effort that we put in architecture kind of regularly. Is it really, did I really talk already for almost an hour? Is it, what time is it? Okay, I'll do one more thing, and then we stop. And so, anyway, basically, we all know, and now we are going kind of 6 years later, what happened in America on September 2001, and ironically, in the same year, I had the choice whether I wanted to be part of a competition to reconstruct the World Trade Center, or to construct in China the headquarters of China Television Company. And basically, these two invitations posed a dilemma for us. It was clear that we couldn't do kind of both. And basically, because I felt that at that point, American society was no longer a kind of creative society, but deeply committed to nostalgia and to memory. And particularly in the case of the World Trade Center, also deeply committed to self-pity. So we chose the Chinese example. Chinese had just decided to organize the Olympic Games, so there was a great optimism about the direction that China would take, and that China was taking, in certain cases, evident. So I found that a fascinating challenge, and particularly I wanted to, in China, kind of visit the notion of the skyscraper, because obviously the skyscraper was maybe the newest topology generated by technologies. Started kind of somewhere here, but then in a massive way kind of reached China and Asia in general. But on this transition, it had lost a lot of its creativity and imagination. And so therefore, I wanted to see whether it could be kind of recharged with intelligence. And I wanted to also, in a way, try to denigrate or to criticize the skyscraper as it had become simply a tall building without anything. So this was the new CBD of Beijing, as it was kind of rendered. And it was the challenge, how to put a building here. It was an enormous scale, 500,000 square meters, so a scale almost unimaginable kind of here, without being kind of one of these elements. So we looked for a condition that did not simply consume a kind of piece of the kind of city, but that also generated a kind of point of the city, and also a shape that was not the same from every side, but basically a shape that would be a dynamic presence in the whole city. It was an incredibly ambitious diagram. There are kind of film studios in the ground floor. There's technical apparatus in kind of one of the arms, kind of script writing and creative activities in the other, and then a kind of a level of management and communication. And importantly, one element where the Chinese, public element where the Chinese kind of population could enter and could both witness TV making, witness the technical apparatus, and see experience all the kind of components. It was also a logic of a contemporary creative effort to make sure that the components were not isolated from each other and all connected in this kind of single loop. There's also a hotel kind of next to it that needed to be made. And here you see, kind of the first rendering, and also, kind of statement like this one, where the shape itself, whatever, even if it's overwhelmed by larger pieces, still kind of retains its identity. Now, what is very important and kind of perhaps not kind of really realized is that basically in globalization, any architecture enterprise is by definition an enormous range of collaborations. And to work on CCTV, at some point we worked with another Chinese kind of company. The company came to Holland, kind of worked in our office, had its entire floor, hated European food, had their own kind of restaurant. So there was, again, a deep mutual engagement. And there was also a kind of very deep engagement with the intellectual side and mathematical engineering side of China, because the building in itself required new rules or adjusted rules or a new way of kind of thinking about gravity even. Because in Marxism, the kind of most straightforward way of treating gravity to go directly kind of through vertical kind of lines back into the ground was not applicable to this building. So basically what was kind of beautiful is that, you know, in the context of the project, we met maybe kind of 6 times with a kind of elite of Chinese engineers and mathematicians, and were constantly kind of asked to develop more and more knowledge about the building, because they kept asking and kept kind of saying, you know, this may not work, that may not work. So Arab and ourselves went into almost obscene detail knowledge of every component of the building. And that, of course, was only possible kind of because of the new kind of supercomputers that kind of gave us the opportunity to do it to make the calculations in time. But it also meant that based on this knowledge, we could deeply kind of change the design. So this is a stress diagram on the outside of the skin. And that taught us that kind of, for instance, certain parts had to work very hard, so we doubled them or tripled them. Certain parts didn't have to work, so we simply took the structure out. And that created this kind of very varied kind of version of what otherwise would have been a kind of really very strict kind of diagonal diagram, identically spread over the entire facade. So here again, you know, it's a kind of interaction between Chinese skepticism and our creativity, kind of mobilized kind of basically through the means of the computer that enabled this. And so that is, you know, for me an important part of the entire effort and also the entire explanation of this kind of project. What the building did in any case is to introduce new ways of looking at gravity in China, which I think is a big deal. We knew so much about the kind of building in the end that we even calculated that the connection between the two halves could only be made at a certain moment in the day, at 6 o'clock in the morning, because only at that point the two halves would be cooled off in terms of expansion through different exposure to the sun. So it's the first time that kind of structure was also kind of related to time. Here some kind of building kind of efforts, seeing the kind of scale, and basically this coupling kind of early in the morning that could not take place kind of 12 minutes later or earlier. Here you see a kind of worker. This is a poem that the workers wrote, scratched on kind of one of the columns. And then that was also, for me, a kind of important sign that the building was not an alien imposition, but that there was also, it also mobilized pride on the Chinese. And of course, we have the kind of strange situation that, you know, we were very criticized for working for authoritarian kind of regimes. Then when we were kind of built, done, we were treated by Western media as if we represented the new China. And nevertheless, there's now a kind of president who is against the building. So the building went kind of in its short history through almost all the conditions, welcomed in China and then less welcomed in China, kind of criticized in the West and then at some point welcomed in the West, blah, blah, blah. So it's a total turmoil of different readings. But I want to kind of end this presentation simply in terms of showing the building as it now physically exists and what to me is exciting about it. It's a building that, you know, I prefer almost this image where it's like a black hole. It's a building that can basically has in my eyes, amazing ability to associate itself with any environment in China. The new one, the kind of old one, the messy one, the poor one, it doesn't kind of really matter. It has an ability to connect itself with elements of traditional Chinese kind of history. And I want to, you know, kind of show a series of pictures that show how this building is kind of really truly unstable in terms of its identity, and how it can be either a ring or a hammer, or and how this kind of instability is for me an incredible quality, but probably for the Chinese current regime that is emphasizing stability under any conditions, kind of really a problem and an eyesore. Here at night. And this is a kind of sequence of this kind of movement, and how this structure outside also introduces inside a lot of almost sculptural kind of conditions. Okay, so end here because otherwise we have no time. I realize that almost any of this doesn't offer any comment on Sweden. It's a completely un-Scandinavian kind of presentation. So I'm not sure what you can make of it, but let's see.
Past 10, but I hope anyhow we will stay some time more than planned, and I'm sure everybody likes that. Now, Rem, it's very hard to see how to start discussing this, but and maybe it will be some other question that interests me. In relationship to your work, but when you talked about the technology as a driving force, to me, to a certain extent, it reminds me of Bruno Latour's actor network, where the world seems that we are humans, but the non-humans, like machines, or for that sense, ideas communicate with us as agents. Do you have any relationship to Bruno Latour's thinking?
Yeah. We were friends, and then that is of course a kind of interesting situation. That of course in a lecture like this, I barely touch on kind of influences or on. Even on collaborators, even though in abstraction I mention them, but it's certainly the case that we were like I guess kind of almost all architects at this point deeply influenced by kind of thinkers, and in my case, kind of most of those thinkers came from France. I don't know exactly why there was an affinity, but I would say that in the very maybe the most inspiring of all of them was Roland Barthes, who in mythology described the world in a very unique way through semiotics, where basically nothing was unimportant, and whether he was describing serious things or unserious things, he did it with a kind of intelligence that extracted from all those examples meaning, and I think that was very important in opening also kind of for me the possibility that I didn't always have to look at formal architectural expressions or at serious architectural expressions, but that anything could be read as a kind of significant to architecture or meaningful. Even if the meaning was kind of vulgar, or so that was important. And Bruno Latour, in the last 20 years, was kind of certainly important also in working on in helping me switch from a kind of metropolitan obsession or interest to taking the countryside more seriously. Because that was for him, he was kind of really more and more kind of looking at the earth, the ground, literally, and the kind of first meter of the ground, what was going on there and how we had to protect that.
Okay, that's so I wasn't mistaken, and when I saw some similarities. Another question that has been of great interest for me, and it also relates then to the 2020 shock laureates, Andrea Branse. And Andrea Branse, I assume a super studio must have been sort of when you were formatting in your time. And they had a very negative and almost absurd vision that reveals what architecture was offering. And in certain texts you have written that like architecture is monstrous in the way in which each choice leads to the reduction of possibilities. But even your architect seems very positive.
Well, I basically was confronted, and this is where the kind of 68 question is kind of really interesting. 68 created a kind of situation where, in a way, any one of my generation had an obligation to be critical. Yeah? You were critical of the state, critical of politics, critical of every party, critical. And a number of Italian architects who were actually extremely gifted artistically, basically worked in this domain, and they made a number of very beautiful drawings, but also developed really beautiful ideas. Andrea Branse, I don't know whether you know, it's a kind of project called Non-Stop City, which was kind of almost a field, a Cartesian field, where, you know, kind of with kind of regular intervals there was some kind of small, maybe fountain or water or electricity, and which was otherwise could be inhabited anyway. And Super Studio also made kind of very beautiful collages of really radical kind of lines that went through the desert or through any other condition. And I became friends with them, but there was always this tension, because they said, this is maybe a beautiful drawing, but we are critical. So everything remained critical. And at some point, you know, I really needed to challenge them that, you know, was it really critical, or was it a kind of serious architectural project? And was it interesting to produce something which is only critical and which is supposed to remain critical and not be kind of realized? Or is it more kind of radical or more daring to also make the step towards implementation, or to and particularly to, can you combine a critical attitude with making things? And obviously I made that choice, and the kind of result is that for many people, you know, the making things dominates, and that the kind of critical dimension, which I hope I've shown is very present in everything I do, is moved to the background.
Yeah, apparently when one watches your work, you seem like you're both critical and a practicing optimistic architect. But I once had a conversation with Manfred Tafuri, and just when I tried to also see that it could be a possibility of being placed on both sides, he just screamed and called me a monster, and
yeah. It
was here in Stockholm, so I've been a monster ever since.
Yeah.
But
really? Okay. So I can testify you're not a monster, but I think there was kind of something very Italy was really in the grips of an ideology that was, on the one hand, enabled kind of really very strong fantasies, but that was very intolerant at the same time, and that created a really taboo to take things kind of on any other level than official criticism. And I met Tafuri a number of times. I never spoke to him, but I think that he was indeed a kind of very nihilistic kind of writer who really forbade kind of people to think in a certain way.
Yeah. Trying to still be in this range of questions, it also seems that this in the 60s, early 70s, there was the counterculture had a sort of a liberatory repertoire, not only in architecture but in how it talked and designed. And originally this was directed against capitalism, but has been since been sort of been integrated as a part of the thinking of big companies. Do you see that that the type of you talked about, we are now in a technological world where we're being always supervised, but that way of interacting and trying to open up a society has been turned against us.
Yeah, I mean, the way you describe it is kind of, probably more or less accurate, but at the same time, I think we need to be kind of incredibly careful that we don't fall into kind of moralistic cliche, and that goes for myself. I'm not talking about you, but I do think that the connection between technology and extreme economic gain and extreme intelligence, because obviously the intelligence collected in Silicon Valley is kind of extreme, but without the input of a kind of social program, is kind of, which is the kind of almost desired outcome of giving or surrendering completely all our values to the market economy, is a kind of very logical outcome. But I think that I'm not saying that this will be forever the case, or that it cannot be changed, or that we cannot kind of basically evolve into a different kind of political system. Although kind of right now the signs are really dire, obviously.
Yeah, they are, and here in Sweden we now just have the election and in a new right-wing government, who is and anyhow in our country we shouldn't talk too much about Sweden, maybe, but there's a new morality coming on, which I also tend to see it's in Central Europe, and that affects architecture. It seems like we are getting closer to a sort of an architecture that's again traditional and like more like a stripped classicism, and then of course that's is very strong today, I feel.
Well, yesterday there was a kind of prize ceremony, and I gave a little kind of presentation, and I was kind of saying that you could kind of read my work as an engagement with globalization, but the kind of result is that, you know, I did work in Russia, work in China, work in Qatar, work in Syria. So in retrospect, you know, I worked on a kind of huge scale for the wrong people. So I'm very alarmed at the kind of current moment where basically we are only judging, and whenever we judge, we basically judge negatively other systems, and where it seems that diplomacy has completely disappeared, and where an interest or a curiosity how other people live is also kind of replaced by sheer negative judgment. So personally, I'm really remain very committed to not only diplomacy but also communication, and I actually do everything to kind of remain involved in China, and even remain involved in kind of Russia in terms of a number of completely positive and unrelated to any kind of regime activities, because I find it too simplistic to cut off every connection, but also every possibility of Russian citizens to live into, to have a different kind of reality than the one the regime wants them to have. So, and I cannot comment on the situation in Sweden. I think your problem is that you have such a beautiful history of stripped classicism that now you cannot protest anymore that people want stripped classicism. Maybe you have been too enthusiastic about your own past.
Yeah, well, maybe we will see what happens. That's not only the stripped classicism who is back in Sweden. There are, but to change the subject a little, I have to ask, have to comment on that, because you are often misunderstood. A comment, "Fuck the context," has been sort of very well known and used in Sweden, mostly misunderstood even here. But the fact is that in Sweden, anpassning, adaptation to the architectural context is formulated in the Planning and Building Act. It means that we are maybe the only country in the world that it by law we has to adapt. I don't know. It can't be the case in Netherlands.
I think fact context was, of course, a provocation, but I was really becoming a bit bored by the obligation and the simplifications that contextualism kind of imposed, and simply indicating that there were certain scales that simply could not be contextual in the traditional way, but that could establish relationships in another way. And basically, the surprising thing about contextualism and in a way obligatory contextualism as you see it here, and as you see it, kind of, for instance, also in the last 20 years in Berlin, is, of course, that it doesn't work, because you cannot go from hotel to here and see everything new, incredible amounts of kind of really hideous buildings that all conform, that are kind of having this more or less the same roof line, but that are kind of really radically uncontextual, but in too many cases also completely without any creativity. So, and that is the same thing in kind of Berlin, where there was a kind of very rigorous obligation to maintain kind of certain profiles, etc. And but where it really went at the expense of some other possibilities of architecture.
Yeah, that's the critical reconstruction of him. So it's still here around in Stockholm, and I think that in Stockholm has had a great relationship to Germany. In earlier there was a better contact between the Anglo-Saxon world, but architectural today it's Germany.
Really? I didn't realize that. And do you feel that's bad?
If you ask me,
okay.
Yes.
Is that generally a kind of shared feeling in the audience, or kind of?
We in Switzerland is Germany in that sense.
Okay,
also, yeah.
Okay.
I don't know. Maybe say no, or if you don't agree with me. But I think that the presence of Switzerland is very strong.
I basically. One of the kind of things I enjoy most is making exhibitions, also with partners, and I'm still working on an exhibition with a friend, Hans-Ulrich Oberst, who is an art creator, which is called Small Nasty Countries, and we want We want to do an exhibition of Netherlands, Singapore, and Switzerland.
Yeah, include Sweden.
So maybe we can kind of address that issue, the Swedish suffering under Swiss imperialism.
Yeah. We are looking forward to that, and I think that's for our discussion for the time being. Anyhow, could be a nice end point, and we have to invite the public if there are questions or then comments if we are a small nasty country. I think architectural-wise, but are there any questions? So they can then use my microphone, and Teresa, you can walk around.
I think you could also simply talk. Without microphone.
Yeah, but then it doesn't go into the streaming. Unfortunately, everybody has to use a microphone.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for a very good and interesting lecture. And I think it was interesting when you talked about the sort of shift when the Reaganism, Thatcher era came and architects became a tool for the market, or however you formulate it. And I think it's interesting, what is your personal experience going from like doing these theoretical projects addressing like, for example, public relations to data in Paris, to what I assume being constantly approached by developers who want to use the brand of OMA as a sort of stamp of approval for them to sell property?
I think that by combination of design or deliberate effort on my part, but also kind of somehow what I suggest to the, or what I broadcast in a way or signal to the rest of the world. I'm kind of really lucky that kind of, and in a way a very old-fashioned architect, because most of my kind of buildings are public buildings and are buildings for the kind of public sector, and I have kind of worked really very little for the private sector. I've recently kind of finished a building in Berlin for Axel Springer for the kind of new headquarters for also their kind of shift to the digital, and that is kind of really one of the few developer architectures I've done. At the same time, you know, our office has 8 partners, and those partners can work sometimes independently, sometimes we work together, and there is a lot of work that the office is doing for and with developers, but I think it's not necessarily led to a kind of situation where we can rubber stamp the intentions of developers or our uncritical tools in their hands. I think there's always a dimension of wanting to look at a particular aspect. For instance, there are 2 towers in Stockholm that we did. Reinier de Graaf did them. There we were in an interesting situation. For instance, the form was already completely given, and so initially we of course tried to kind of find a different form, but then at the moment that Reinier thought, and I was part of that discussion, okay, let's take the shape, but let's see how we can develop a kind of process of prefabrication that is interesting, but that also gives a new dimension to, or let's say a new life to the whole idea of prefabrication. It achieved something more than mere developer's architecture in my eyes. So, you know, we always try I think I can say that, kind of regardless of maybe any other kind of criticism you could vent to the office, but there's always an additional dimension that we want to look at.
Yeah, I have a question maybe also, because I know there's a lot of young students in here that are sort of go into the subject from now on, so to speak. And the question might be around, there was sort of a, or let's put it this way, do you think it's relevant to see architecture as a discipline, you know, that has boundaries around it somehow, where some things are suited and some others are not?
Well, yeah, the answer is no. It's you must have noticed that I'm kind of somebody who's deeply aware of the instability of the current moment, but I'm probably also kind of somebody who's responding positively to instability. And I would say that, you know, in the kind of early period, I was incredibly bored by the disciplinary borders around the architecture, and kind of really, you know, and for instance, I can describe one example. I was once in a lecture by Louis Kahn. And Louis Kahn was kind of pontificating on the stage, kind of talking about the eternal values of architecture, how architecture could have huge effects on mankind, how beauty was universal, identical in Pakistan to Philadelphia. And the kind of the speech was, even though I had the greatest respect for his work, but the speech was really revolting. I mean, I had to leave. And so, if you would have asked me this question kind of 40 years ago, I would have said, I'm totally against those limitations, and we need to kind of find other inputs, other connections, other influences. But now I think that we are, you know, on such a borderline kind of situation where all limits are kind of erased between different territories, that I've become a lot more positive about the discipline of architecture itself, in the sense that at least what we have been able to do is to kind of preserve a domain, and it's one of the rare domains where kind of knowledge that is 3,000 years old is still kind of relevant, is still cultivated, and is still plays a role. Yeah? So in that sense, I have to admit that the discipline of architecture is perhaps and one of the most relevant today, exactly because of its conservatism or its ability to manage kind of a really enormous stretch. And that stretch is not only in time, but kind of more and more we're also kind of course able to look at the kind of architecture of China, the architecture of kind of Russia, and actually extend the canon to wider and wider dimensions, even embracing kind of vernacular architecture in its realm. So, in that sense, I have no criticism of no fundamental criticism of those borders anymore. Which isn't to say that a lot of boring things happen within our domain.
Yeah. Hi Rem, here's a question. Thank you for the lecture today. And the question is more of asking for a prediction. Do you think that architecture that is produced today has a capacity to offer some sort of invention that architects of the future will be studying, researching, interpreting, looking for new meanings in a way similar to how we look at architecture of the past now and how you do look at architecture of the past yourself?
I didn't get your last sentence.
Do you think that architecture produced today has a
no,
capacity to mention that architects of the future,
well,
architects of the future will look at what's done today, looking for new meanings and interpretations?
Well, I think that is kind of such an open question that I can only say yes. But what I do, I mean, obviously, in the past kind of 30 years, we've been kind of really confronted with an almost free-for-all for architects, but also the complete abandonment of common terminology, but also common kind of visual language. It's been the kind of explosion of individualities that had kind of some very kind of interesting dimensions, but that are, if you look at many of the examples now, including my own, I would say, don't create a kind of sense of this is the future or this is something we should develop. On the contrary, it's kind of clearly coming to an end, simply because of global warming, and therefore, I think it's a kind of very interesting moment because we, by external forces, we are kind of forced to kind of work on a kind of common themes, much more common themes than kind of even 5 years ago. And so I don't know in what terms architecture produced in the 5 years will be considered, in 10 years. I have no idea. But probably, as a kind of mixture of awe, how crazy could they be, but at the same time, profound criticism, how could they raise so many kind of resources? And the idea that whether we want to or not, we are now kind of forced into not necessarily a kind of collective thing, but at least in common kind of assumptions or common knowledge, and all being forced to contribute to a serious effort. I find that really very interesting and welcome.
Okay, it seems there's no more questions, and then I suggest we. Yeah, here is one. Sorry.
Thank you. Yes, I have a question. Given the fact that a lot of researchers in sustainability nowadays claim that we should build no more, there's enough space, it's a matter of distribution of the spaces that exists. I'm wondering what you could say about architecture being tied into the new project. And if that's absolutely necessarily so, if we can also communicate to students another way of approaching architecture that is not tied into building new constructions. And I think that's also, given your own extensive research on urban conditions and so on, I mean, could you just provide another kind of perhaps definition of architecture that undoes this link to new constructions?
I don't know whether we can completely undo the link to new building, but the idea of, let's say, the notion of preservation, I think is incredibly crucial and also provides a kind of really partly unexplored territory for imagination. And I don't know whether you know, but I think in the Biennale in 2010 we had an exhibition on preservation and kind of really claimed preservation as a site for the contemporary architect, and try to, for a while, kind of really undo the apparent conflict between kind of new building and preservation, or wanting to the world to kind of stay as it is, and wanting to change the world, because I think that is a kind of fake opposition, And I think that preservation should not be seen as a kind of per se conservative effort, but it should also be seen as a kind of responsible way of not wasting kind of resources. And I would say that some of the most, for me personally, kind of most interesting things we have done recently are in the area of preservation. For instance, the garage in Moscow is kind of an incredibly kind of respectful treatment of a kind of building that was there in the kind of 70s, and that we gave a new life, and that's a kind of very exciting domain. Yeah, so I agree with you. But I agree with you on the condition that it doesn't mean necessarily that from now on nothing new should be built, because I think that would be too gloomy as a kind of perspective.
Okay, and that be the last word for this shock lecture by Rem Koolhaas. Shock. So I thank you. First, I thank you, Rem, and then I thank the audience, and I thank the Royal Academy of Fine Arts. But not the least, we have to think a bit about role of shock today. Thank you, and have a nice continuing day.